Hi class, I want to make this video addendum just to fill in maybe some blank spots that I might have left in my weekly wrap for week 2 on defining terrorism. As you can see from your efforts from week 2, it's not really possible to provide a universal definition of terrorism. And in my book, that's okay. You know, I think the idea that we need a universal definition of terrorism may be a good ideal, but I don't think it's going to happen. You know, there are just too many divisive factors in the world for that to occur. For example, Iran may say that we're terrorists, and of course we think that Iran with Hezbollah is terrorists. So, I don't think the universal definition is really a practical reality anytime in the future that I can think of in the near future. But I do think that operational definitions of terrorism are absolutely necessary for agencies to do their jobs. So in other words, you probably saw the difference between, say, the FBI definition of terrorism and some others. That's because their definition is oriented to their mission statement. And I think that in order for scarce resources, funds, and personnel to be allocated effectively in that organization to conduct their mission concerning terrorism, that's necessary. So I think that's a very good thing. We also had the idea of what terrorism is. And of course there's often debate in these classrooms about, what's terrorism, what's insurgency, and that sort of thing. I think we can see that we had elements of both in Iraq, for example. But I think that there's a difference between terrorism and, for example, crime. Crime is murder, rape, robbery. Those sorts of things are in our criminal code. And what makes terrorism different is that while terrorism may exact a horrible penalty from people, including beheadings and that sort of thing, which certainly if it was done in the case of a murder would be a crime, it's different from crime in that it has a political motivation, and therein lies the difference. So, I think there's a very great difference there. Now, you may also hear the term terroristic acts. Well, that can move from one category to another. For example, you could have a neighbor who really hates you for whatever reason, and your neighbor comes over and burns your house down. Well, of course, that incites fear and terror in people, and so that would be a terroristic act, but it would be a crime, probably several crimes by the time they got done loading charges on there. But if it was not politically motivated, then it would not be terrorism. Now, if you're a Shiite and your Sunni neighbors come over and burn your house down because you're a Shiite, then that is a political act. Because in Islam, traditional Islam, there is no separation of church and state. So these things can get a bit convoluted in how you define them. And you will see a lot of different, definitions out there. I always find it rather humorous that the UN, which is a interesting organization, I guess you could say, to say the least. I think it's morphed over the years into something that's not really what the original framers intended it to be. But, it's defining terrorism, but on the other, seeks to define terrorism, but on the other hand, it harbors state sponsors of terrorism, within its ranks. So I think that's a bit disingenuous, to say the least. But, in our nation's history, we can say that we had terror and terroristic acts all the way back to at least the time of the Revolution. The British and the Americans, I think, used Indians. They leveraged Indians, I should say, to create terror in each other, probably during the Revolution. Also, the Loyalists on the British side and the Americans, colonialists who were fighting for their independence, often didn't like each other at all. and there were some pretty terrible acts committed, I think you'll see if you go back and read some of that history. Then, of course, if we get up to the Civil War era and after, we have Reconstruction. And there were pros and cons on both sides of Reconstruction. You know, many corrupt politicians from the North went into the South during the time when the South was under military control after the Civil War. And there were a lot of injustices committed on both sides in that, and created a lot of animosity. A lot of horrible acts took place at that time, and a lot of the problems that we have today between races, I think, stem from that time period, which certainly was not what Lincoln envisioned would take place after the Civil War, but of course, since he was assassinated, he wasn't there to see that through, carry it through to fruition the way that he wanted it to be. And then I grew up in Appalachian coal mine country, and I can certainly tell you that there were some really horrendous mine wars, so to speak, up to the time of the creation of the United Mine Workers, and some pretty violent things took place after that as well. So, you know, we have some labor-related terrorism or terroristic acts taking place. I think if you were a miner back in the days before the United Mine Workers, you might feel you were being terrorized by mine owners. I mean, some of the people lived in company towns. They weren't paid in money. They were paid in script, and they had to use it in the company store. I mean, it was pretty much like slaves. So, you know, there were a lot of injustices there. And that goes back to the question of, you know, are you fighting for your freedom, or are you a terrorist? You know, if you're a mine owner, you're saying these people are terrorists. If you're one of the people that, you know, has to live in those sorts of conditions and there's no way out but violence, you might feel differently about it. So, you know, one of the takeaways I want you to have is that terrorism is a very complex issue. And I just want you to think about that. And, of course, next week we'll be talking about the differences between international and domestic terrorism. And there'll be some crossover, I think, between the two. So just keep those thoughts in mind, and I hope you continue to enjoy the course. It sounds like many of you, or some of you at least, who have talked to me are doing that. And I really encourage you to not only learn in the course, but, you know, make it a really enjoyable experience. All right. Thanks so much, and I'll see you, so to speak, in the classroom.